In 1873, Mark Twain co-wrote a book called The Gilded Age, which was a satire on the times he was living in. The word gilded comes from metalwork and means to take a piece of cheap metal and cover it with more expensive metal, usually gold. And so from the outside, what you're looking at appears to be good or expensive, but on the inside it isn't as nice, or perhaps isn't as sturdy. That's the critique that Mark Twain was making of the Gilded Age in his novel. In the period after the Civil War, roughly from 1865 to 1893, or some historians put it at 1898, you have this period of massive industrial expansion and economic boom. And if you only look at the period for a moment, that's all you'll see. But the Gilded Age is extremely complex, and what Twain wanted people to realize is that when you peel back the layers of cool innovation and economic growth, you see a lot more. You'll see the workers who were exploited by their bosses. You'll see the many economic busts that came with those booms. You'll see the incredible amount of political corruption that went along with making that industrial expansion happen so quickly. So let's take a moment to look at this period as a whole before we jump into it. Just like with the antebellum era, there's a lot of moving parts with the post-Civil War period, because really what's happening is that all of the social and economic and political problems that we had before the Civil War didn't just go away. Some of them just got put on pause while we were busy killing each other, and not even all of them got put on pause, really. And so what you'll notice as we move through this time period is that the Gilded Age and Progressive Era that comes as a result of that are actually going to look very similar to the antebellum era that we talked about last semester. And so the Gilded Age is a time of both economic growth due to new technology like the Bessemer process that makes it easier to create steel, and economic crises because the corporations like Carnegie Steel that make those goods often act irresponsibly. It's also a time where there's massive expansion of political participation in the sense of discussions about politics. There's increased involvement in socialist organizations that are more equitable across gender and racial lines. Women continue to push for suffrage and other reforms on both state and federal levels. And labor organizations increasingly call for reform in both urban and rural areas, organizations like the Farmers Alliance and AFL. But at the same time, the Gilded Age was a time of exceedingly corrupt political practices that led to massive political oppression. Jim Crow laws led to segregation and the stripping of voting rights from African Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act effectively barred further Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States to try to make a better life for themselves and their families. And local party bosses and political machines created corrupt systems of state politics. And it's incredibly important for us to realize that these things don't have to be either or scenarios. Oppression and the expansion of rights can happen simultaneously. That happens all the time in American history because people are complicated and our systems of freedom and oppression are complicated. I, for example, can be given access to certain things as a white person, but simultaneously oppressed because I'm a woman. That happens to people all the time. We have to learn to see the complexity that surrounds us every day and that we interact with every day in our history as well. That complexity comes into play especially towards the end of the Gilded Age as reform efforts in the Progressive Era overlap with global conflict and war. As we'll see, social ideas about race, social Darwinism, and eugenics will very much shape the way the United States reacts to problems overseas and our role in it. None of these things happen in a bubble. So as we go through these lessons, we need to be aware of both when we are in our timeline, but also where we are in our timeline. For now, though, let's focus more specifically on politics in the Gilded Age. This will be a sort of general overview since the topics that we're going to cover were really the dominant issues throughout the time period. First and foremost, it's important to realize that the Gilded Age overlaps considerably with Reconstruction, and one of the defining characteristics of the federal government during Reconstruction is that it was really quite corrupt, partially due to plain outright corruption and partially due to a lack of oversight because at least some people were more concerned at the start with keeping track of what was happening with the South. So some prime examples of this are these here. In 1872-1873, the New York Sun implicated a whole ton of congressmen in a railroad scandal involving the Union Pacific Railroad, who, if you recall, was building half of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific created a fake contracting company called Credit Mobilier to inflate the cost of building parts of the rail line by almost double, and then used the extra money to bribe the congressmen in Credit Mobilier stock to keep giving them government contracts. In 1875, a group of whiskey distillers was caught bribing IRS officials so they wouldn't have to pay an excise tax on their product. Grant's own Secretary of Treasury was the one who led the charge to convict over 100 of them, but there was still a whole bunch of public outrage because one of the accusations was that the money from the bribes was being used illegally towards Grant's re-election campaign. And then probably the longest drawn-out scandal was the Star Route scandal, which involved the Post Service. When Congress opened up mail routes across the South and West in 1845, the U.S. Postal Service didn't have a whole lot of regulations as to how those would be divided up and handled, especially since people were moving out there and expanding so fast. And this led to massive corruption because essentially anyone who wanted to deliver the mail and had a stagecoach to do it could put in a bid for a contract. And the post office could choose, in theory, the lowest or most reasonable one to deliver the mail in that area. The problem here was that some post office officials weren't picking the lowest one. They were picking the highest one prearranged with that person and then taking some money off the top as a bribe for having chosen them. And they did this for years before anyone figured it out. And so Congress starts an investigation in 1872 under Grant into this, but that investigation gets messed up because people bribe the investigators, which is not a great look for the Grant presidency. So they start again under Hayes, and it goes into the Garfield administration and inevitably the Arthur administration since Garfield gets shot. Even though the investigations pretty much clearly laid out in terms of evidence as to who was guilty, the two main conspirators had excellent lawyers and were acquitted. But the public, whose taxes go towards paying for the Postal Service, were understandably angry. So this becomes one of the major events that leads to calls for civil service reform. So obviously a lot of drama happening in the background of our political arena, but that wasn't the main focus of politics in the Gilded Age. When it comes to things people were actually concerned about, these were the three major issues: hard versus soft money, civil service reform, and tariffs. Now, we've already learned a bit about hard and soft money when we talked about the gold standard at the end of last semester. So the idea here is that hard money is money that's backed up by gold most of the time, and paper money or greenbacks are what are called fiat money. This is money that's backed up by symbolic value, which is essentially things like the health of the overall economy and the overall strength and stability of the government. This is the kind of money, fiat money, that we use today. But in the Gilded Age, there's a huge debate about what kind of money they're going to use, because for years, the US government had been switching between different kinds of currency depending on their situation, like during the Civil War when they expanded it to greenbacks or fiat money to meet their needs. So if you remember from our lecture before, if this is super confusing to you, what you really need to remember is that rich people like the gold standard and hard money because it's more stable for them to take out massive loans and do business in huge quantities of money at a time. Poorer, or at least average people, like farmers and workers, tend to like soft money or greenbacks, or sometimes it's referred to as the free coinage of silver, because that gives them more options when it comes to their currency supply and makes for more money to go around. And so when it comes to politics in the Gilded Age, Republicans tend to favor hard money, and Democrats and populists like William Jennings Bryan tend to like soft money or the free coinage of silver. This is why when we talk about this last semester, we saw William Jennings Bryan giving the Cross of Gold speech. Here he says, "You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. I tell you that the great cities rest upon these broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the utmost, having behind us the producing masses of the nation and the world. We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." What he's saying here is that industrialists and manufacturers and Republicans seem to be under the impression that what's good for farmers and what's good for manufacturers is the same thing. That's the logic they use to apply to tariffs. And he's saying that this logic isn't necessarily correct and that they need to watch themselves and listen to the needs of farmers because the industrial economy is completely reliant on agricultural production, not the other way around. And just like we've seen a million times before at this point, he uses this very obvious obvious Christian metaphor of a crown of thorns than a cross, which is biblical imagery of literal torture, because we know that Americans very much identify political and religious iconography as the same. This debate over hard and soft money comes so much more to the forefront after the Panic of 1873. As we can see from the cartoon of the train terrorizing the people with its club of capital, the American people very much blamed the federal government and its hard money policies that promoted the growth of businesses like railroads for the collapse and continued downfall of the economy. This led to unemployment marches on Washington like the one led by Jacob Coxey, although he wasn't the only one by any means. The other economic policy that preoccupied political debates was tariffs. To put it as clearly as possible, Republicans supported tariffs and Democrats opposed them. Democrats tended to be Southerners and workers who wanted to pay less money for consumer goods. With the exception of African Americans and a handful of farmers in the Midwest, the Republican Party was made up of manufacturers who wanted tariffs to protect their businesses from foreign competition. So when Cleveland becomes president and is the first Democrat to be president since before the Civil War, it's super logical that he goes after tariff reform. Democrats argued that tariffs cause corruption by making manufacturers rich while ripping off the common man. In theory, tariffs also led to political corruption by unnecessarily making the government the source of this dirty profit, and also leading to an equally tarnished profit for the federal government to the tune of about $100 million that should have belonged to the American people. Although, to be fair, in theory, the government should be spending that back on the American people, but that becomes a whole argument of who it should be best to spend it. But the biggest problem here, for Cleveland at least, who was calling for the tariff reform, was that the government's revenue from the tariffs was ridiculous amounts, like way more than they could spend. And so it was really becoming a tariff for profit rather than a tariff for revenue only, which brings us back to an almost Revolutionary War-like discussion of forms of taxation which are fair and forms which are not. Republicans like William McKinley balked at President Cleveland's attempts at reform, arguing that the interests of manufacturers and their customers were the same, and that failing to protect American businesses from foreign competition was equivalent to failing to protect America. In the upcoming election of 1888, this did not go well for Cleveland, and he lost to Republican Benjamin Harrison, in the Electoral College at least. He actually won the popular vote. Harrison promptly passed a really superficial form of tariff reform that lessened the tariff on literally nothing but raw sugar. By continuing to protect refined sugar, the McKinley tariff protected Louisiana growers and led to political unrest in Hawaii and the overthrow of their monarch. And last but definitely not least is civil service reform. This isn't going to make any sense unless you know what civil service actually is. So a civil servant is someone who works for the public good. The most obvious form of this would be government workers, but civil servants also include smaller government workers like postal service workers, police officers, firemen, and teachers. Essentially, people whose job are meant to contribute in a meaningful way to the well-being of a functioning society. And so the problem in the Gilded Age is that because so many of these jobs at both the federal and state local level are appointed positions or positions that can be purchased through contracts, there's so much corruption, especially because the country is growing at such a fast rate that regulations can't keep pace with the growth of the economy. So essentially, economic and political corruption is outpacing our ability to even realize what's going on, much less make rules to prevent it from happening in the first place. And so the idea is that we need reform in the types of people who are doing these jobs so that the people who are in charge of the government contracts and the workings of our government aren't going to fall into bad practices to begin with. Now, this might seem like a bit of a no-brainer, but remember that half of the way that people were able to get into office was by trading votes for offices. So if you suddenly tell people that there are qualifications for government jobs, that eliminates people's ability to even have a chance at becoming powerful to begin with. So trying to get politicians on board with cutting into their own chances at power is a really difficult task. But keep in mind that ultimately, politicians are responsible to the will of the people. And so if the people are loud enough, they will in fact listen to some extent. So here's what happens. One of the things that sways public opinion in favor of civil service reform is the slew of scandals that we saw in the federal government during the early part of the Gilded Age, especially the Grant presidency. Credit Mobilier, the whiskey ring, and then the corruption of the Star Route investigation were a lot for people to see all at once. And then when the main conspirators of the Star Route scandal didn't even really see major consequences for that, it was a huge blow to public confidence in the federal government. Add to that the fact that in 1881, President Garfield is assassinated by James Guiteau, a member of the Republican Party, who thought that he deserved a government position, but who didn't receive one because Garfield didn't really know him, like, at all. The 41-year-old, not particularly successful lawyer stalked Garfield for months before shooting him in the back at a railroad station. In the wake of Garfield's death, Congress passed the Pendleton Act, which stipulates that federal government jobs must be awarded based on merit and not necessarily on one's ties to a politician. It also prevents government employees from being fired or demoted solely based on political decisions. To enforce the law, Congress also created the Civil Service Commission. On the local and state level, most political affairs are run by what are called political machines. These machines are small groups from one political party, although both parties had them in the US, that use their money, power, and influence to dominate certain states, cities, and other regional areas. The leaders of the machines are often called party bosses. Perhaps one of the most notorious of these was the Democratic political machine Tammany Hall, and in New York City, their leader was Boss Tweed. It's important to realize that these political machines are simultaneously extremely corrupt, but also provide much needed support to local communities that weren't often provided by any other means. That support, though, came at the cost of having to then support the, in this case, Democratic Party. So, in essence, here's how it works. Let's say that you're an immigrant coming to New York, in this case, from Europe, and you've just arrived after weeks on a ship and you're exhausted. You finally made your way through customs at Ellis Island and you're here with your whining children and you haven't had a proper night's rest or a good meal in days. And you're here and you're super confused because you don't necessarily understand where to go now or how to find a job, and maybe you either barely understand English or you don't understand English at all. So understandably, this is super overwhelming. And the people at Ellis Island were probably not super friendly to you because they're just trying to poke and prod you to make sure that you're not diseased or a criminal or whatever. So you arrive on the docks at New York City and some guy, a low-level worker for Tammany Hall, greets you and offers you a cup of coffee and a snack for your screaming kid and asks you if you need help finding somewhere to stay for the night. And that's literally the nicest that anyone has been to you in weeks. And you ask this guy how much money he wants in return, and he says he doesn't need any money from you. Score. All he does is hand you a flyer for an event that they're holding tomorrow for the Democratic Party and says if you'd like another cup of coffee and a free meal, you should stop by. And that's how they hook you. And so initially, these political machines are reaching out with kindness, helping people get on their feet, helping people find a job, making sure the neighborhood is more or less a safe place. And honestly, that's a lot of what they spend their time doing as politicians because it's in their best interest to keep the people happy. That's like politics 101. But at the end of the day, now that they've done something or a million things for you, you have to vote for them. You have to keep them in power because that's really what they're after. Because for the $5,000 that they spend on helping immigrants get settled in each year, they're raking in $50,000 in extra cash personally from the corrupt government contracts. So really, they're pretty happy to keep the little people happy because it keeps them happy with their corrupt contracts and power. But in order for them to keep working like that, you have to keep voting for them. And if you stop voting for them, they'll take you into a back alley and break your knees. That's not a joke. There are certain streets in New York City, around Mulberry Street in particular, that were known as dumping grounds for the mobs after they finished with people that they either beat up or killed as messages to other people to not act out. And all of this is possible in part because voting is a public act. Everyone knows who everyone else is voting for because there's not secret ballots like you have today, which we'll get to later. So in essence, this is a very basic social contract. This is really how political gangs and mobsters work in the US. We'll see the same thing again when we get to Al Capone in the 20s. But of course, some people are on to Boss Tweed and his massive corruption, people like cartoonist Thomas Nast, whose work you can see here. So, the genius behind Nast and his work is that a lot of the people who are supporting Tweed are immigrants and working people. So, tons of them aren't literate, they can't read. Which means he could write the world's greatest expose on what's happening within Tammany Hall, and they would never know. And so, he does this with cartoons. And in all of these cartoons, he portrays Tweed as exactly the same sort of look, so people always know who he's referring to. Like the one on the left that shows Boss Tweed is so big and above the law that even if you put him in jail, he'd be able to just walk over the walls. Or the one on the right that shows him as having money for brains. The idea here is essentially that you may think that he has your best interest in mind because he's taking care of your basic needs and the needs of your community. But at the end of the day, the only thing he thinks about is money, and you should never forget that. The political issues at stake in the Gilded Age reflect the complexity of that time. Scandal and corruption are inherent reflections of expansion without proper planning, and the continued discussion of monetary policy and tariffs reflect unresolved conflict over the roles of agriculture and manufacturing in the American economy that have been there since Hamilton and Jefferson. But through small steps like civil service reform, the United States moved towards resolving partisan problems and laid a foundation for how such problems might be solved in the future, a framework that would prove immensely powerful in coming decades of reform.